So my name is Dr. Alice Butler-Walk, and I am a lecturer in sociology here at the university. And I'm going to be talking to you today for about the next 45 minutes or so about one of my absolute favorite topics, which is about the media's role in the production of marginalized places. So this talk, Fear and Loathing in the City, is thinking specifically about how different neighborhoods and different communities come to get a negative reputation in some way, and thinking particularly about how the media has a role in that. And we're thinking about different types of media as well. We're thinking about social media, and we're thinking about more traditional forms of media too. So to get started, our plan then for the day is we're going to think a bit about the background to this kind of question, who I am and why I'm interested in this. And then we're going to talk about really, why does stigmatization and marginalization of places matter? We're going to touch on some terminology that's important. And then we're going to get into that big question of what role does the media play in stigmatizing and marginalizing places. And then to finish, we've got a couple of case studies. One is based on my own research, and one is a more contemporary example that we can think about as well, feeding into some kind of more current affairs that you might be familiar with as well. So you can start to see how some of these issues play out in real world situations too. So, as I say, I'm Dr. Alice Butler-Walk. I'm a lecturer in sociology here at the University of Reading. I started in September this past year, so still getting used to the place, but really enjoying it, really enjoying teaching students and having those contact and really exciting sessions with students every week. My background is in social geography and sociology, so kind of sitting on the interface between those two things. So thinking about communities and people's experiences of communities. And one of my big interests is thinking about people's experiences of places. So why do people like certain places and not like other places? And why is it that some places get labeled in a particular way that can be negative or can be quite positive? And how does that shape people's experience of those places as well? So as we go through today, I'll be drawing on some of my own research. Some of these are academic papers around the stigmatization of place. And then you can see on the panel over here, a chapter from a book called Landscapes of Hate as well. If you're interested in reading any of these papers, I'm happy to share them with you. And I think Morgan will pop my email address in the questions box at the end. So if you've got questions, you're more than welcome to pop me an email, and I'm happy to share any of these resources with you. These are papers that cover questions around the stigmatization of place and the kind of marginalization of place and how we experience place more generally, but really thinking about how it is that certain places get that reputation. So the first question that we've got really is thinking about, if you take a second, the first thing I want you to do is to just have a think to yourself, if there is a particular place that comes to mind when I say to you that a place is undesirable or a place that has a negative reputation. Is there a place that comes to mind for you? And you're not sharing that, so just have a think to yourself. And there are lots of reasons why people stigmatize places. And what I want to start then with is a poll to get an understanding of what you think makes a place undesirable or stigmatized for most people. So Morgan, if you're able to help with that one, we've got this first poll for you to have a guess of what you think are the factors or the criteria that make a place undesirable or stigmatized. And this is one of those where you can choose multiple options. So if there are a few things that you think might contribute to that, then you can click multiple choices there to get a sense of what you think might be a factor in people's understanding of what makes a stigmatized place. So I'll just give you a minute or so to take part in that poll. Great. So one of the answers that's coming in is around the visible appearance. So people's perceptions of place being based on what you can see in the environment around you. So things like litter, things like graffiti, some of those kind of common tropes that we often learn about, like things like broken windows, and what we see when we're kind of walking through a street. So often that's something that people think of as being undesirable or as a feature that is stigmatizing. And as we go through the rest of the presentation, I'll share with you some of my own research that kind of tells us what some of the factors are that people use to stigmatize places. But generally, it's a whole range of things, including all of these factors that are in the poll. So anything from the history of a place that has a negative reputation, all the way to the visible appearance, lack of resources, perception that the place might be in some way boring. So again, quite subjective things, and varies for different people in terms of what they might think about a place. So it's possible that the place that you thought of as having a negative reputation has some of those characteristics. Maybe it's a place that you've been, that you've experienced has a huge amount of graffiti or litter or that kind of thing. Or maybe it's a place that you've heard about, either through friends and family or through the media or televised depictions of a place as being a place that might be dirty or has one of the options in that was about the perceived presence of a particular group. So often people fear or dislike an area because, for example, it has a perception that there are a lot of youth in the area, and sometimes that's associated with negative views about youth and young people and antisocial behaviour. So that's another element of what we'll be talking about in our sociology lectures at Reading. We talk a lot about perceptions of youth and family and of different groups in society and how that plays out. Okay, so we're thinking then about the stigmatization of place. And when we're thinking about stigmatization and we're thinking about marginalization, there's a few key bits of terminology that we need to get a handle of before we can get started. So I've got this image that accompanies this slide of some Lego blocks. And the reason I've got Lego blocks for this is that when we think about place and we think about the stereotypes that are used to describe place, essentially the stereotypes that we use are the building blocks that we use to help make sense of the world around us. And we always tend to think about stereotypes in a very negative way. We tend to think about stereotypes as essentially being prejudice. But actually, stereotypes can form a useful way that we make sense of the world around us. If we were presented with every single social situation and we had to make sense of it anew as if we'd never encountered it before, then suddenly we'd be absolutely exhausted and we'd have very little time to actually make sense of anything else. So having these stereotypes that allow us to categorize and to make sense of the world helps us to kind of make an informed judgment of things without having to go back to square one every single time. So we can think about stereotypes as positive or negative ways that help us to characterize the world in an informed manner. So while stereotypes can be positive or negative, prejudice is always negative, and it's about prejudging. It's about the negative feelings towards members of a particular group, or in the case that we're talking about today, of a particular place as well. And sometimes when we're thinking about place, we're actually thinking about the people that live in that place. So when we're talking about a particular town or a city or a region, it's often a way for us to talk about the people in that region. It's a way that we can access that conversation through a kind of spatial lens. Discrimination is a word that we need to think about as well if we're thinking about the marginalization of place and the stigmatization of place. And discrimination is where you act upon prejudice. So you discriminate and there are tangible effects where you have acted in a prejudiced way towards an individual, a place, or a group. And stigma refers to an attribute that's discrediting. We actually just talked about this in class this week in one of our modules. We were talking about the stigmatization of people and spoiled identity, which are some concepts that you might have come across before, but we'd certainly be covering in first year. So stigma refers to an attribute that's discrediting. It refers to some aspect of an individual's character, or in the case that we're talking about today, a place's character, that is in some way tarnished or is in some way seen as less than in terms of the way that we view things in society. And when we're thinking about marginalization, we're talking about socially excluding an individual, group, or place based on perceived attributes. So generally, that would be based on prejudice. So we're thinking about marginalizing or socially excluding is a way that we can think about marginalization. And basically, it's this metaphor that we're thinking of sending to the margins a particular group or person or particular place that is perceived in some way in a negative way and therefore will be treated differently. And one of the key theorists that we think about when we're talking about stigmatization and marginalization is Erving Goffman. Some of you may have come across Goffman before. He's a really influential theorist whose work I really enjoy. And he talks, we've got a few quotes from Goffman here about there are different types of stigma. So stigma is used to refer to an attribute that is deeply discrediting, so something that spoils the reputation of an individual or place or group. And he talks about 3 different types of stigma. So this is written in the 1960s, so some of the language will be quite dated, but he's talking about abominations of the body. So often sociologists refer to stigma from a Goffman perspective when they're thinking about medical or disability type studies and the stigmatization that people with chronic illness, for example, would experience. Then there's blemishes of individual character. So if your character has some kind of attribute that is stigmatized or is in some way falling short of the expected social identity that an individual might have. And then he also talks about tribal stigma of race, nation, or religion. Now, Erving Goffman's work is really influential, but when we start to think about place, he doesn't overtly talk about place. So it's also really helpful for us to think about Bourdieu. So Pierre Bourdieu is a French theorist who we also talk about a lot in our sociology lectures here at Reading. And Bourdieu highlighted the importance of language, and he talks about the way that the words and the language that we use and the power that the words and language that we use hold, and how the words and language that we use have symbolic meaning as well. So we're thinking about essentially the damage that can be done with the words that we use, particularly when those words are coming from individuals who have some level of power in society. So one of the people who is really influential when we're thinking about marginalization and stigmatization of place is the French-American sociologist Loic Wacquant. And Loic Wacquant joined together the work of Bourdieu and the work of Goffman. And he said, really, if we're thinking about stigmatization of place, we need to join these 2 things together. We need to join Bourdieu's work around symbolic violence and Goffman's theory of stigma to get an understanding of the different ways that societies and groups and places specifically are marginalized in the era of modernity. And he refers to this as advanced marginality. So it's basically a way of talking about the different ways of social exclusion that occur in a modern society. Particularly, he's talking about in a post-Fordist, so post-industrial, post-1980s specifically society. And I've highlighted in green the bit of this quote, which is most important. And Wacquant is talking about how the stigmatization of place means that an individual is confined to a branded space or a blemished setting. So he's talking about a place that bears the same stigmatized characteristics as Goffman was talking about. So while Goffman was talking about these characteristics as applied to an individual or a group, Loic Wacquant takes this a step further and says, drawing on Bourdieu's work as well, we can think about this in relation to place, and that there are certain places that have a reputation, and that those reputations are blemished or tarnished in a particular way. So if we pull apart some of this quote, it's quite a long quote, but the key aspects I've put in bold. So, and I've put in bullet points beneath as well. So the key takeaways really are that when we're thinking about the stigmatization of place, we're thinking about a negative image that exists in the social imagination. And generally, if this negative image exists, it's based on things that are seen as negative or scary or worthy of being marginalized in society. So we're thinking about things like delinquency, or historically, in the examples Wacquant has looked at, things like immigration status or insecurity, so that places have universal renown, so that places are known. Generally, he argues that places have a sort of either national or international reputation. And he was doing a lot of work in the 1980s, particularly around areas in the United States, around Chicago. And he said that at that time, areas had a reputation if they were proximate to or near to Chicago. And if you lived in Chicago, you probably had some aspect of that reputation because you lived in that branded space. There's also this element of branding. So we need to ask, where does it come from? And that's what we're going to be exploring today as well, that some of this branding of place comes from, some of it will come from policy or from government. But what we're going to be talking about is how a lot of this comes from media, both social media, and in the case that Wacquant was talking about in the 1980s, we'd have been thinking about more traditional forms of media as well. So The last thing is this sense of confinement. So the idea that people who are stuck in a space that is marginalized or that is socially excluded are stuck there. They're relegated to that place and it's difficult to get out of it. One of the things that Vacan talks about that's really important is that stigma is sticky. So he means by this that if you live and you have one stigmatizing attribute, other stigmatizing attributes tend to stick to it. So he tends to talk about how areas that are stigmatized, not the residents in those places, don't just have the stigma of place. They possibly also feel the stigma of class, or they might feel the stigma of race, or other attributes that might be seen as in some way discrediting, to use the Goffman type language. So we know then that stigma has a cumulative effect. So once you've got one type of stigma, you're more likely to kind of accumulate other forms of stigma as well. And in addition to that, it's really hard to throw off stigma. Once you've got some kind of stigmatizing attribute, it's really hard to get rid of it. And research shows us that in the case of Chicago, in particular housing estates in Chicago, the reputation of having been from or lived in that area persists even when people have moved out of that area and moved across country in the United States. So it's really important for us to get an understanding of why marginalization happens and why it matters. So why does it matter? Well, yes, the reputation sticks, but is that really important? So yes, it is. Living in a marginalized or stigmatized neighborhood has an impact on your life chances and your opportunities. Your life chances are affected by where you live, so things like access to resources, but equally your life chances affect where you might live. So your resources or lack of resources might determine where you're able to live. So it's this kind of self-reinforcing situation that we've got, where we have a situation where an individual may not be able to afford to live in a neighborhood that has a good reputation, therefore they live in a neighborhood that has a poor reputation, and with that their life chances are further negatively affected because they have lower access to other types of resources. And that's my next question, the next poll for you, of what kinds of opportunities do you think are affected by living in an undesirable area? So this is our next poll. So we've got a few different choices. We've got job opportunities, access to healthcare, access to community resources, access to a safe environment, or all of the above. So what do you think if you're living in an undesirable or a marginalized or excluded area? Yeah, so we're seeing comments coming in about all of the above. And yeah, that's exactly it. So we can experience a huge number of different negative experiences from living in an area that has been branded as undesirable or having a negative reputation. And we can actually just look at a whole list of some of the things that we can experience from residents in one of these kind of maligned or negatively perceived areas. So there can be mental health effects. So lower levels of well-being. If you're living in an area that's perceived negatively, you're possibly going to experience a higher level of distress. You're possibly going to internalize the stigma that you feel people have towards your neighborhood. If you think that people are seeing your neighborhood and you in a negative way, you might internalize that and start to see yourself in a negative way too. It can also have physical effects. So you may have poorer health outcomes, which is often due to, you might have heard the term postcode lottery. So it might mean that you have lower access to healthcare. Often we see lower life expectancy as well. And we also see health impacts of environmental issues like contamination and pollution. And we've got an example about that towards the end as well. We also see social effects too. So your life chances have impact in terms of mental health, physical health, but also socially too. So life in a stigmatized neighborhood may have fewer opportunities available. We see in research examples around quite extreme things like being unable to get a job because of the postcode that you have. And we've had studies, there's some really interesting research in France where people have applied, the same person has applied for a job with different postcodes, and the people who live in an area that have a stigmatized postcode are less likely to get that job, even if everything else is the same in their job application. The social effects also include things like poorer living conditions and the social stigma that carries in, as we've said, kind of professional settings, but also in social settings as well. So there's also research that suggests that even things like getting a taxi to be able to drop you off at home may not be possible if you live in an area that has a poor reputation, and you might need to be dropped a few streets away because taxi drivers may not want to go to that street where you live. So there are a huge number of effects that living in a negatively perceived neighborhood can have on you. So then we come to the question of what role does the media have? And this is where some of my research has been looking. And I've looked, and we'll talk about one of the areas that I've looked at specifically in a particular community in the city of Liverpool. But really, I've looked at how different types of media perpetuate and accumulate and help propel this idea of certain negatively perceived spaces. So my research has shown the role of the media in stigmatizing places. I've looked at social media and I've looked at traditional forms of media like television and newspaper coverage. And these traditional forms can have a stigmatizing and marginalizing effect. But social media can also create a narrative of marginalization. And they act in different ways, but they're still just as damaging. So when we think about some of the theory behind media, a really useful theorist who we've been talking about again in our Thinking Sociologically module this semester is Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall was a fantastic cultural theorist who was based in the UK. He was Jamaican born, based in the UK, and he did a lot of work around the perceptions of race and cultural theory, and he also did a lot around media. And he talked about encoding and decoding. So Stuart Hall's work tells us then that media messages are encoded by the sender. So the journalist who is putting out a broadcast or who is writing a news article, he was specifically talking about television, but it holds regardless of the media that we're talking about. That's encoded with certain messages so that the receiver will decode it in the way that's intended. However, that doesn't always happen because we all have our own experiences and our own social realities that mean that we will interpret things or decode things differently depending on the context in which we're experiencing that message. So if you and I watch the same news report, depending on our own lived experiences, we might decode that in different ways. Same with you and a family member or a friend. You might decode them in different ways because of different experiences. And it's even more stark when you think about class and race and gender differences as well, that you're more likely to decode messages differently. And as a result of that, journalists attempt to frame issues by encoding with particular words or ideas that will share common meaning among viewers or readers. That means that when particular words or phrases are used to frame the story, it's an attempt to try and get people to decode the message in the way that was intended, because of trying to kind of bypass this idea that we may all decode differently. And we'll talk about some examples of from my own research of how that encoding was actually done so that different messages were put out in different ways. So why then does traditional media stigmatize or marginalize places? Well, the first thing is the most basic, and it comes down to an economic question, that stories of marginality, exclusion, and stigma sell. So media wants to sell. They want you to watch broadcasts. They want you to buy newspapers. They want you to read stories on their news websites. And it's far more exciting to have a story on there about people who aren't getting along with each other, people who are being excluded, than have a lovely story about how everyone gets on with each other and it's all lovely. So there's that political economy kind of angle as well, that there is a sales incentive essentially for these stories of negative reputation. Often traditional media use stereotyping images or stock footage, and there's different reasons for why this might occur. One of them is this point below here, that actually journalists might not even go to the place that they're reporting about. In some of my own work, that's what I've seen as well. I've seen journalists who have reported about a place from hundreds of miles away and have never set foot in that area. And in the age of social media, where it's possible to get stories and to use things like Google Street View to see what a place is like, you may never actually set foot in the place, meaning that you have to rely on stock footage or footage provided by others, or stereotyped and stereotyping images in order to kind of get a sense of footage for that area. And stereotyping images, again, this kind of ties into the idea of the choice of image that goes along with an article. If you think about a newspaper, it can't just be as long as you want. It's kind of limited in terms of page number. It's also limited in terms of words per page. So you've got to think about what's the most important thing to have on that page. And it's going to be therefore that every word has to carry it has to be its most effective. And the images that you use also have to be really effective. And sometimes it comes down to using stereotyped images in order to encode things in a certain way. Local residents then are often silenced at the expense of official voices. And that's something I'll show you in my own research in a little while, that you often find that residents don't get a say. They're not the ones who are quoted in a news article. And I'd suggest that's something to keep an eye out when you're reading news. Who is actually quoted in what you're reading? Is it an official voice like a politician or some kind of representative of an organization? Or is it a resident or somebody with lived experience of the situation that you're talking about? That's really important to start seeing and to start thinking sociologically. Also, key phrases or descriptors are used to invoke or encode stereotypes. So we'll often see particular words that are used to send a message of what a type of place is like. And I'm going to show you in a little while an example of the use of the term inner city to put forward a particular stereotyped view of an area. So I'll show you that in a little while. And on social media, we see that it's a place where different and often anonymous voices or potential to be anonymous voices have the opportunity to share their views with an audience that they may not actually ever meet face to face. And our research has shown that people use social media to stigmatize and marginalize places for different reasons. Most people then stigmatize other places, so places that they don't live. Most people stigmatize or marginalize entire towns or cities rather than specific streets. This is really interesting. So the way that we went to find out about this is we wanted to understand what people meant when they used the word shithole on social media. We were looking at Twitter back in 2017, 2018. And we wanted to understand what it was that people meant when they used that word, because people use it a lot. And it's an expletive that sometimes is used for humor, but equally there has to be something that they're using it for. Why is that word being used as opposed to something else? And we found then that generally people were using that for other places. They were referring to other places as a shithole. Generally, we found that people were referring to entire towns or cities as a shithole. What we found was really interesting was that people who identified as women tended to stigmatize on a smaller scale. So they tended to stigmatize specific streets, parts of their own home, for example, as a shithole, whereas people who identified as male were tending to stigmatize entire towns, cities, or even regions. Some stigmatization or marginalization can be based around humor. And that's again something I challenge you to think about. Next time you're watching something on TV, particularly if it's like a live comedy type thing or a comedy stand-up type show, pay attention to the way that place and communities are talked about. And generally you'll find that very stereotyped images of place are used to make jokes. And it's often used to create some kind of distance between a particular audience and a different place. So it's then used by the comedian to create an affinity or a sense of belonging and bonding with the audience in one location at the expense of an audience in a different location. And as I say, some stigmatization or marginalization can be of one's own area. And that's really interesting. We found that particularly some people would talk about their own place as a shithole. And some people would do that for humor purposes. Some people would do that as a way of internalizing the stigma. So some people felt bad that they lived in a place that was seen in a negative light. And some people did that in an almost protective way, that they said, yeah, this area is bad, but it's our area. We're allowed to stigmatize it. Other people aren't. And then we'd also see, interestingly, and other research highlights this as well, that you see stigmatization working on different scales. So maybe you post online that you live in an area that is seen as a shithole, but you're different. Your street is a bit different to other streets. So there's lots of different ways of creating distance and creating affinity with other places too. But generally, we see that social media discourse is further used to kind of create this sense of marginalization and to create this sense of difference between groups of people. So I'm going to talk now about a couple of case studies. And the first case study I'm going to talk in more depth about. The second one, as I say, brings it a bit more up to date. But the first case study I'm going to talk about is in relation to some of my own research. So I grew up near the city of Liverpool in the northwest of England, and one of the neighbourhoods that carried a really negative reputation was an area called Toxteth. And Toxteth had a really mixed reputation. I was growing up in the 90s. I was aware of that reputation then. But equally, I was aware from talking to my parents and people who were older than me that that reputation had existed for far longer. Now, in 1981 and again in 1985, there were a series of uprisings in Toxteth. And what's important to know is that Toxteth is a historically ethnically diverse area. So Liverpool is a port city. It played a huge role in the slave trade, which is something that the city is still trying to make amends for, essentially, and trying to recognize the role that the city played in that. And as a result of its location, thinking about trade, we saw that a lot of different populations came to settle in the area, in Liverpool generally, and then Toxteth more specifically. The uprisings then in 1981 followed years of systemic oppression. Employment rates had historically been very, very low in Toxteth. There was a high percentage Black population in Toxteth that was being systematically excluded from things like jobs, so employment rates were very low. And there was a high occurrence of stop and search by police of Black male youths. So in the 1970s, kind of leading up to 1981, there was a huge amount of social injustice occurring in Toxteth. Much media would refer to what happened in Toxteth as riots. So people refer to them as the Toxteth riots. I made the decision in my research to refer to them as uprisings because I think riots, again, was a term that was used by the media to create a particular view of what happened. And it very much places the blame on one side and doesn't really see the entire context that was occurring. And the context that these events were occurring in were that there was years of systematic and systemic oppression and repression of a population that was suffering high levels of inequality, unemployment, and poverty. So my research then looked at approximately 2,000 newspaper articles dated from 1900 to 1999. And I took any article that mentioned Toxteth, and I looked at the Mirror, the Express, the Guardian, the Times, and the Financial Times. So that was 5 newspapers, and I chose them because they represented a range across the political spectrum and across the type of newspaper available. So the Express and the Mirror were tabloid type newspapers. The Times, the Financial Times, and the Guardian tended to be historically broadsheet papers. And then you had the Express and the Times that were more right-wing politically, and the Mirror and the Guardian that were more left-wing politically. And the Financial Times is often seen as being somewhat more neutral, kind of in the middle. It often reports purely, slightly more, certainly, of fact, and tends not to be swayed quite as much by politics. And my aim in this research was to understand the production of place-based stigma and marginalization in print media. So obviously, I was looking at a time before social media. So the first thing I want to show you is going back to that thing I was talking about in relation to quotation source. And I suggested that when you're looking at things in the media, you might see who is or isn't given a voice. And what was really apparent to me, this is looking from the entire time from 1900 to 1999, of who actually gets a voice in the stories of Toxteth. So in all of those newspapers, we can see that invariably it's either outsiders or nobody who gets a quote and who gets quoted in newsprint. And it's a very, very small percentage of residents who actually get a voice. So we see that actually it's the largest percentage of residents who are given a voice is in the Mirror, followed by the Express, which was a surprise, followed by the Guardian, then the Times, and then not at all in the Financial Times. The Mirror perhaps isn't a surprise because it's more left-leaning and more populist, if you like. But it is a surprise that it was the Express, but potentially the kind of political leanings of the Express were slightly more different earlier on in the 20th century. But crucially here, we learned then that generally residents were not given a voice in the telling and the shaping of the narratives of their own neighborhood. They were excluded and marginalized from the telling of the place where they lived, essentially. I also said that when we're thinking about encoding and coming up with messages from the media that are given a particular angle and that are attached with certain tag words or key terms that come to have meaning. This is something that I saw again and again with media coverage of Toxteth. And I've taken just a few screenshots of some of the words that were used to describe the place. So you see at the bottom, you've got Toxteth riot zone. So again, using that word riot. You've got a no-go ghetto. We see a few different examples of the word ghetto being used. Ghetto, of course, having huge connotations, and particularly when we're talking about what have we got here? This unlovely area. So that was much earlier in the 20th century, which is quite an odd way of framing things, but certainly more common at that point. A rundown inner city area. Inner city, we're going to come back to in just a second. The troubled area of Liverpool, a deprived, multiracial, multi-religious area, and riot-torn. So some of these terms are really emotive. And these are words that are then used to kind of give a sense of what that place is like. Because journalists realize that not everybody who is reading that newspaper will be aware of what the area is like. So they're giving a very, very brief descriptor that helps a reader decode it in a way that will make sense and in a way that matches what the encoder wanted it to be framed as. And the use of the term inner city is really, really interesting. So the term inner city came really from across the Atlantic. So the term inner city was used in the United States, starting in around the 1960s, 1970s, and it was particularly used to refer to, unsurprisingly, inner urban areas. And those inner urban areas were places that were generally poor, had high levels of deprivation, were generally areas that were had a high level of racial diversity, were generally high level, in particular in America, of an African-American population. And when we're thinking 1960s, 1970s in the United States, we're thinking this is an era that hasn't long been desegregated. So there's huge amounts of meaning that comes then when we're thinking about the term inner city. And what I found when I started looking at the way that the term inner city was used in relation to Toxteth was that it was used tremendously from 1980 onwards, really coinciding with the advent of the uprisings, or the riots as they were called by the media. And why is this important? Well, we see this huge spike across all newspapers really from 1981. We see a few earlier mentions in the 1970s in the Guardian. And then we see a huge spike, and again, another smaller spike in 1985 when there were further uprisings in the area. And this is really important because when we start to see that newspapers are using this term inner city, they're actually referring to a whole load of different assumptions that people will bring when they hear that term. So we're making sense of the world. We're using those stereotypes that we have about what an inner city looks like. We're thinking about the different ways and different attributes that an inner city would have. And then when we see that word and we see it applied to Toxteth, we then apply all of those same stereotypes to make sense of what that place is like. So even without ever having been to Toxteth, even if you were sitting in the south of England, you'd never been to the city of Liverpool even, and you read a news article that described the inner city, Toxteth, the inner city of Liverpool, you're going to have a very specific idea of the type of place that Toxteth is. You're going to take away some of the meaning that is applied to inner city, and you're going to apply it to Toxteth to try and make sense of what that place must be like. So this is really important. It's also really important that we see that it coincides with the Thatcher government and quite a right-wing Tory conservative government that was in play in the 1980s. We then saw kind of responses to this inner city terminology with ministers of the inner city and that type of thing, really problematizing and making the inner city a problem in British politics and the British imagination of what places are like. So a last kind of case study to just draw your attention to is the Flint water crisis. So we're moving across the Atlantic to the United States to something that is a bit more recent. This isn't based on my own research, but it's something that you might have come across in the news yourself. You might be familiar with this. So Flint, Michigan is an area, again, that has a high level of racial diversity. Quite a large proportion of the population is African-American, also Latino population, high level of unemployment, high level of deprivation. And in April 2014, the city switched to sourcing water from the Flint River without treating the water with anti-corrosion treatment. So up until that point, the city of Flint had received water from the Detroit water supply, so Detroit being another city in Michigan. And then what happened was that leaching from old pipes led to contaminated water. And if you Google Flint water crisis, you'll see photographs of really discolored water, sort of like browny red colored water that people were being given. That was what was coming out of their taps that they were expected to wash with, they were expected to drink. And this water started causing a huge outbreak in disease. Legionnaire's disease. And I think we're still starting to see that there are impacts that we hadn't actually anticipated in terms of some of the chemicals that were in that water during that period of time that have led to knock-on health effects. So one of the things that has been discussed in relation to the Flint water crisis is that this is an example of environmental racism. Flint is a historically Black city, and therefore we start to see that actually there is an environmental racist component to the reason why there were cost-cutting measures taken in a historically Black neighborhood as opposed to a historically white neighborhood, for example, in terms of which city would have the essentially contaminated water source and where cost-cutting measures would be in place. But how does the media play a part in this? Well, the media failed to give voice to residents. Residents have been talking about the problem with the water in Flint far, far before the media actually started picking up on the story. And once the media did start picking up on the story, they tended again to favor official voices. They tended not to talk to residents. And in fact, what they did was they further reinforced negative stereotypes of African American and Latino residents, creating an image of a dangerous, lawless, and marginalized place and population. So we see then that actually the media has a huge role to play in any type of social situation, any type of crisis. And really what we don't see is the media generally holding power to account. We see the media is actually exacerbating the situation and feeding into existing stereotypes and existing social exclusion and marginalization that already exists. And in the case of Flint, we see that this had really detrimental effects, that had the attention been drawn to the situation earlier, potentially we could have seen a reduction in health impacts, we could have seen access to clean water coming sooner. And eventually the water source was returned to coming from the city of Detroit rather than from the Flint River. But by then a lot of the damage had already been done. And the argument that a lot of sociologists will make is that yes, this was environmental racism, but also the media turned a blind eye initially. And then when it did start reporting, didn't give voice to the voices of the residents, and then didn't give a depiction of the area that would counter stereotypes and actually further fed into that stereotyping. So in both Toxteth and in Flint, Michigan, these were areas that were already stigmatized or held negatively in the public imagination. In both cases, residents were subjected to oppressive practices, and in both cases, the media failed to give voice to residents as experts of their own reality. That's something that we should be really concerned about as sociologists, that people with lived reality are the experts in their experience, whether that's in terms of lived experience in a neighborhood, lived experience of a health condition, lived experience of anything, that people with lived experience are the experts in that particular area. In both cases, the media perpetuated a view of the areas as being dangerous, criminal, deviant, and different. And in both cases, residents suffered the effects of even greater stigma after the uprisings and water crisis in Toxteth and Flint, respectively. So that stigma stuck. Today, if you mention Toxteth, if you Google Toxteth on Google Images, you still get images of the uprisings showing up. If you Google Flint, even 10 years after the water crisis, you'll still get images of discolored water. So the reputation has, as we talked about earlier, stuck, and it's really hard to remove that stigma. And that stigma has stuck to a place that was already stigmatized and marginalized from a racial perspective as well. So then the question is, how do we stop the spread of stigma? That seems like it should be a next step for us to talk about. And if you have ideas about how we stop the spread of stigma, just take a second to think about that. Like, how do we stop the stigmatizing and marginalizing of places in the media? And I'll be really impressed if you've come up with something, because honestly, it's really difficult to do. The media industry often works, as we said at the beginning, with this kind of sense that there is a need to make profit, there is a need to sell copy. And more than that, marginalization and stigmatization of place creep into media as a form of humor and comparison. We talked about the examples of things like stand-up comedy, often using like place-based stigmatization and marginalization in order to differentiate between places and to create a sense of humor. There are things that we can do. So as sociologists, there are things that we can do, and it's really hard because we don't want to be those people who say, well, we can't tell jokes anymore, because nobody wants to be that person. But what we can do is we can resist engaging with stereotyping media coverage, and we can try to find local reports of issues that prioritize residents' voices. That's hard to do, though. Local media and local newspapers are declining, so we can continue to support those by reading those things, because generally they're the places that we will hear residents' voices. We saw that in the Grenfell Tower disaster as well, that for months and years ahead of time, residents had actually been talking about the issues in Grenfell Tower. Had we listened to those voices, potentially lives could have been saved. So we need to actually engage with local voices, and one of the ways we can do that is through kind of local media. We can try to avoid generalizations. Yes, we might have an opinion about a particular area, but it might be generalizing to say that that entire area is a particular way. There'll be good and bad, whatever good and bad mean, in any area that we're thinking about. We can listen to people who know places rather than trusting social media views of a place. It's very easy, I think, to sit and to see on TikTok or in the old days on Twitter, people talking about places as being this or being that. But actually talk to people who've been there, talk to residents, talk to somebody you know who's been to that place. And yes, they might still have a generalized stereotyped view of the place, but you're actually going to find out more about what they perceived of the place rather than just blindly trusting something that's posted on social media. And we can remember that what we read may not be an accurate representation of the situation or place, and try to keep an open mind. It's really hard to do because there is so much information that comes at us through traditional media and through social media. But keeping an open mind and thinking, well, why is it that I think about this place in that particular way, can be a really good way of starting to get an understanding of, I think I probably think about that because of this conversation or that interaction. And keeping an open mind so that we can actually start to resist engaging with this media coverage, with the caveat that it's really, really difficult to do. So I will stop there and say thank you very much. I've popped in a QR code at the bottom, which will link you to my university bio page. So if you've got questions, you can reach out through that or through my email address. And I think Morgan said she would pop that in the chat as well. So I will stop there. And if there are any questions, I'd love to talk more.
Great, thank you, Alice. That was really interesting. Yeah, I've just popped Alice's email in the chat if you find it easier to copy and paste. That's there for you as well. So just a reminder, if you do have any questions, you can ask them in the questions tab. That you can find that on the right-hand side of your screen. And we have had one question come through. And what is the benefit of the media perpetuating negative stereotypes of a place?
Yeah, so I think that's the big question. I think there's a huge, one of the questions, and if you ask a lot of kind of political economists or sociologists who have a focus on political economy, then part of the argument will be it sells stories. It comes down as basic as that, that it's more appealing to read. If you read something that's negative about a place, there is this idea that bad news sells, and generally that does hold true. You're more likely to read a headline and to pick up a copy of a newspaper that's talking about something that is sensationalist rather than, you know, in Reading today everybody got on with each other. Doesn't really make a very good story. So often it kind of falls into this kind of performance that media professionals engage with to kind of create sensationalism that will sell copy. And then it's our job as sociologists to understand the repercussions of that and how we can get a better understanding of the impacts of that for people in those places and for the rest of society who view places in that way. But that was a really good question that kind of gets to the heart of the whole thing, I think. And I think on taking that a step further, actually, and thinking about what's the kind of motive, if you like, on social media, that's when we start to think about things like humor. That's when we start to think about differentiation and creating a sense of hierarchy almost between, I live in this place, which I want to portray as not being bad. So I'm going to say that such and such a place is bad because it's not here. And then kind of creating that hierarchization between places as well. So it comes down to some of those very basic things that we do tend to stereotype, and then it becomes a kind of basis for our humor and our conversations and our interactions with others in society.
Great, thank you. Lots of things to think about there, I think. We haven't had any more questions come in, so I think we will leave it there unless, Alice, you have any final thoughts for us.
No, I think so. I think that was a really good question that kind of got to the heart of everything that we've talked about. And these are the kind of conversations that we have in our classes, and the debates that we have, to kind of try and understand where some of these things come from and how we see the world and why we view it that way, and how we can potentially change it for a way that is more just for everyone.
Lovely, thanks so much. Okay, well, thank you very much everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves, and you've got Alice's email if you have any further questions after today. So thank you very much, Alice, and take care, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.